Amazon turns it up to 11. The latest from podnews.net with the Podcast Show, the new international festival for podcasting in London this May. Amazon has released AMP, a live radio app, seen as their version of Clubhouse or Twitter Spaces.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. Let's start with a bop. Oof, you guys are gonna love this one.
It's available in the US for iOS users only in a waitlist. Oof, it'll enable you to DJ your own music show with tens of millions of licensed songs, they say. And you can take callers too.
Okay, callers, is the album worth a listen? It's so good. I bet you would love the intro. Let's play it.
It's not just music, you can use it for speech too. Guy Raz is doing a show for it, so is Nicki Minaj. The AMP website is live now. In other news, written by Shreya Sharma and Kyla Littman and guest edited by Mignon Fogarty, Sounds Profitable with Claritas this week gives sage advice on the women building the podcast industry. You'll find it at soundsprofitable.com. Gumball has raised $10 million to expand its podcasting host-read advertising platform. The company was built by the team behind the HeadGum podcast network. Spanish-language podcast platform Ivoox says that 43% of all the podcasts created in 2021 were created by women. Radio Days Europe in Malmö in Sweden this May has announced a podcast summit as a pre-conference event. Speakers haven't yet been announced, but we can exclusively tell you Rob Greenlee from Libsyn is one of those speakers, and the summit will be moderated by me. How much should you pay for that podcast deal? UTA has launched a data analytics service called Audio IQ to help value podcast companies. They represent podcast companies in deal-making. Podsights has unveiled a website redesign. We link to what's changed for publishers and brands in our show notes and our newsletter at podnews.net. We hope you like fluorescent colours. Podcasts now make up to a quarter of all time listening on smart speakers, according to Edison Research's Share of Ear study. Cumulus Media and Westwood One's Audio Active Group has released its analysis on the latest data. Poditize, the largest production company in the world, is crowdfunding, it's announced. The company claims 4.2 million monthly listeners. And guesting on the Podland podcast tomorrow is James O. Boggs and Andy Bowers from Spooler.
I love daily newsy podcasts. I listen to many of them. They are literally yesterday's news in many cases. And that's okay because they're doing news analysis, really thoughtful stories. But just this morning, there were all sorts of breaking stories on Ukraine, and there will be for the foreseeable future. That's something that deserves a place in on-demand audio as well.
You'll hear that interview in full tomorrow in the Podland podcast. UK radio group Nation Broadcasting has acquired a 10% stake in Podcast Radio. The company is planning international expansion. Libsyn's AdvertiseCast has added exclusive partnerships with 4 new podcasts, including The Gist with Mike Pesca. Pesca was suspended last year from Slate, who subsequently sold the podcast to Pesca's Peach Fish Productions. In People News, Jocelyn Lee has been hired as VP of Business Development and Strategic Partnerships at Sounder. In 2015, she'd worked at WNYC as Director of Business Development before moving to Hearst. Sam Sanders, who we reported was leaving NPR, is to join Vox Media to host their culture podcast. And Mikey Fowler has been made VP and GM of a new podcast production house called Audiorama. He was previously at Barstool Sports. The company launches its first podcast today called Youth Inc., which is hosted by Adori Labs. And in podcast news, Biohacked Family Secrets launches today following the children of anonymous sperm and egg donors as they uncover the identities of their donors and gather vital medical information. It's from Sony Music Entertainment's global podcast division. This podcast is brought to you by The Podcast Show, the new international festival for podcasting in London this May. This 2-day business event has speakers like the CEO of Wondery, Jen Sargent, and Steph Simon from Clubhouse, access to over 120 global brands and unmissable live shows. Get 20% off day passes with the code PODNEWS at thepodcastshowlondon.com. And that's the latest from our newsletter. To read all the stories in full and subscribe, we're at podnews.net.